Okay. So they haven't had enough time for species to actually evolve. Okay, so this is one of what Darwin called mystery of mysteries. Where do species come from? And what are the mechanisms that cause species or an ancestor to split into two or more species? And so where do species come from? So they just spring into existence? Ancestor. Okay. So descent from a common ancestor, we've already learned about that. And then how species, well, we know one way that species could originate. How did species originate in that little movie there? Yeah, so what was it? How did they become isolated?
Through the rocks. Through the rock slide?
The what?
The rock slide?
Yeah. So there was some geographic event, barrier, that came up and isolated the populations. Okay. So speciation is the process of forming new species. Oh, so what's a species? What do you think? I don't care if you're right or wrong. Just give me something, anything. Okay. Anybody, how about you? Any other definition of what a species is? Okay, but there's all kinds of different living organisms. So what are, in that little movie, that video, what happened that caused those two populations to change? What happened to them first?
You were separated.
Okay. So for speciation to happen, you have to have isolation. Okay? In this case, it was geographic isolation. Okay. So, so a species, we'll say it's the smallest independent, evolutionarily independent unit. In other words, it's made up of a population that is isolated and is independent of any other population in terms of mutation, selection, gene flow, and drift. On these populations, I operate separately. So once you have a species or a population that's split, okay. So species they consist of interbreeding. That means populations that can interbreed with each other, that evolve independently of other populations. So the essence of speciation is a lack of gene flow between two populations that were formerly of one species, and now they've gone off on their separate ways, either because of selection or something else. And the species, in a sense, they form a boundary for the spread of alleles that enables each of these populations to evolve independently. Now, the species problem is actually called that because speciation happens over time. And when we define what a species is, it's a snapshot in time. So a species is not exactly like a real entity like H2O. We know exactly what H2O is. It's two hydrogens and an oxygen. That's water, right? Species, there's different features that we talk about that make one species different than another, but there's no coherent definition for one reason, and that is it's an ongoing process over time versus one point in time. Okay, here's a population. And in this case, there's going to be a geographic barrier that arises. And now each of these populations, they're not exchanging genetic material anymore. They can't. And all the different forces of evolution are operating on that population. Mutation, drift, natural selection, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So, what's a species? On the left, we've got the large cats, Panthera, that's the genus, and has a number of different species in it, including tigers and a couple different species of tigers, different species of leopards, and some others. So these are separate species. They look different. There's some other things that make them separate species. What would happen if you took, if you took a leopard and a lion and tried to breed them? What do you think? Do you think they would end up with a hybrid or not?
No.
Okay.
There may be some isolation and
Okay. So what he's saying is that there's some genetic isolation, and their genes don't fit. I don't know how many chromosomes lions have, but they're different number of chromosomes than what leopards have. So if you brought a sperm and an egg, one from each, they would have separate numbers of chromosomes, and it's likely that you would not even get proper fertilization. Okay? Or you could get a hybrid that perhaps survives a little bit or survives well, but it's completely sterile. Okay? So now, On the right is Canis lupus. These are both dogs. They are both considered the same species, even though they kind of look a lot different even than lions and leopards. Okay? And the thing is, you could have them breed, though I think it would be kind of difficult for these two guys to actually breed together, right? If that was the male on the right and that was the female, it would probably break her, okay? And if that was the male on the left and that was the female, how would she get up there, right? So, in a sense, there's mechanical isolation, but if you actually put their sperm and egg together, you would get a viable embryo. Okay, so because there's species, they're not like H2O, we have a bunch of different definitions of what a species is because it's a dynamic process that happens over time. So the first one we're going to look at is a biological species concept, and that the species is a group of individuals in a population that interbreed to produce fertile offspring but cannot interbreed with other individuals from a different species. Kind of like the leopard and the lion. So it means that they're reproductively isolated from the population. Now, the biological species concept, we have to know, to define it, we have to know whether these individuals can breed. And if you look at a fossil, how do we know that individuals from different fossils were able to breed? We don't. So we have to come up with a different definition for fossils. And it's too bad, but that's just the way it is. Also, this concept doesn't really deal with asexual or geographically separated populations or hybrids, okay? So there's this other species concept called morpho, or morphological species concept. That means morphology or anatomy or physiology. And species are groups of individuals that are morphologically similar and clearly distinguishable from individuals of other groups, including fossils. Okay? Unfortunately, that's kind of an arbitrary designation. Someone might look at two different species and say they're the same, whereas someone else might say they're separate. Okay. And then there's something called the phylogenetic species concept. Okay, so the biological species concept is that states that species are defined by who they can successfully breed with and reproduce and have viable offspring with. And then they're separate in terms of species from groups that even that they might look very similar to each other, but they can't interbreed. Okay, so morphological species concept. Well, first of all, these are fossils. On the left here are trilobites, and it's actually on a timeline. So we've got time, right? Old, young, okay? And each of these is from a different time period. Now, they look very similar to each other, but we have no idea whether they could breed. Let's say that A could breed with C, let's say 2,000 years later, okay? So we really can't say anything about reproductive isolation. All we can say is that these are a chronospecies. In other words, over time, they all look very similar. Same with these right there. And, or you might have something like this where these are actually separate species, and they're cryptic species. If you look from morphologically, you can't tell any difference, but if you actually look at the genes, you would see that each one has differences, and maybe if you did reproduction, you might see some differences as well. Now, the thing is, these frogs here, they look different. According to the morphospecies concept, they look like separate species. The thing is, if you actually sequence the genes, they're genetically similar. In other words, there's not very much difference. They're considered color variations of the same species, even though morphologically they would be considered separate. And then if we bred these frogs, these two different forms, and they produce viable offspring, then we would know that they're actually the same species versus separate. So you can see what the difference is in the different photos. How is genetic divergence in a population determined? Well, we would sequence the genes from both species and we'd compare them. And also we try to breed them and see what would happen. And then there's something called the phylogenetic species concept. This is more looking back in time. So, a phylogenetic species means that each group has a unique genetic history, and so they're classified as separate species. We don't know why that history is different, but we can tell if we do a phylogeny. So a leopard and a cat shared a most recent common ancestor. And then that population from the ancestor was split into two different sections, maybe geographically. And then populations over time evolved to become domestic cats or leopards. So a leopard and a domestic cat, in terms of phylogenetic species, each is unique in terms of phylogenetic species. Now, same thing with a wolf added to the mix. They're all mammals, but leopards and domestic cats shared a more recent common ancestor, right here, than the wolf, and all three, okay? Okay, and all members possess a combination of certain defining traits that you can use those to actually recognize that they're separate species. For example, let's say the wolf, they're all mammals, so that's not unique. But what is unique are a whole bunch of features in terms of physiology and anatomy that are different between the dog family and the cat family. And then, in terms of each species, has specific differences, including genetic differences, that one has that the other one doesn't. Okay. So the question is, where do species come from? We've already determined that comes from ancestors. Kind of like with our family tree. So where do you come from? You come from your parents, right? So it's not like it goes great-grandfather, grandfather, father. It actually goes you, your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, but your siblings and your parents share half of their genes with each other. Just like you are half related to your full siblings or to your parents. And so your common ancestor in that case is your parents. You go back in time to that. But you have also got first cousins. And your first cousins are thanks. Come from your parents' brothers and sisters. Okay? And so the common ancestor for cousins and you is actually back at your your grandparents. Okay? Well, the same thing is going on with evolution. We've got a common ancestor, so here is you. You also share a common ancestor with the cat. It's some placental mammal, probably 40 or 50 million years ago. Both of you share a common ancestor with amphibians previously. So all of these descendants have previous common ancestors. Okay, so speciation is a three-step process. The first thing is that gene flow is disrupted. That means that alleles are no longer traveling from one part of the population to the other. And that can either be because of a physical barrier, or it can be because of some other mechanism, like using different habitats, having different breeding behaviors. Anything that disrupts gene flow in a population can cause speciation to happen. That ultimately disrupts gene flow. Once there's a barrier and the populations are now evolving on their own, each has new mutations coming into each group. They're probably not the same mutations. Different selective environments, all that kind of stuff. So the populations start to accumulate differences genetically and phenotypically because of the four forces of evolution: mutation, genetic drift, which is a function of population size, non-random mating, gene flow, and natural selection. So there's gene flow has been interrupted. And then eventually, after perhaps a long time, there's reproductive isolation that evolves. So that even if these populations became different in different places, if they came back together, they would not be able to breed anymore. Okay? So those are the three things that kind of happen in a process. So this is one population, different lineages, but they're all interbreeding. Right? Even if these are subpopulations, there's still gene flow going on. Okay. And then a barrier emerges. In this case, we'll say geographic barrier. And now, on one side, you have one population. And the other. But over time, they finally have so many changes that you end up with you now have separate species. And they can't interbreed anymore at all. Okay. So now we're going to first talk about geography. Okay. So, allopatric. Allopatric means different homeland. So, different locations. And this is how you get it. So let's say here's, and then vicarians, it's a separation of two populations by some geographic barrier. It can be a mountain range, it can be a river, it could be a rise in sea level, so like off the coast here, let's say 15,000 years ago, you could walk out to Catalina. That was all dry land. It wasn't a separate island. It had the same organisms as the rest of the mainland did. But in this case, the water level, then the ice age ended, and the water level rose. And suddenly, you have islands like Catalina or Santa Rosa or whatever that are now isolated from the mainland. Okay, so that's a kind of vicariant barrier. Or even plate tectonics, where you have one large continent, Pangaea, that starts to split up into separate ones, and they start moving all around the planet to their current configuration. And so they might have all shared a whole bunch of similar species, but once they split apart, each group evolved separately on their own. And then there's dispersal and colonization. Okay. So so here we go. That's the main population. There's a barrier that splits. There's now two populations. They start changing over time because they accumulate differences, genetic differences, and phenotypic differences. And then, if they come back together, one of two things can happen. So what happens if, at the very bottom here, what happens if they come back together? Anybody? So, if those two populations, the orange and the green, suddenly come back together, because let's say there was a water barrier, right? And the water, now there's an ice age and the water level drops. So, what can happen to those two groups? They might not be able to interbreed, okay? And what's the other possibility? What do you think?
They can integrate and breed species.
Okay, they can interbreed, and they actually merge back into perhaps the original species. Okay? So, now, there's also a similar sort of situation, but a little different. Here you have a big place, a mainland, and then a small group flies away to a small island. Oh, what is that called? When a small group from a big population starts a new population. Do you remember? Starts with an F. Anybody?
Founders effect.
There you go. Okay. It's called a founder event. And then the same thing sort of happens. It's the same, it's still allopatric speciation because it's in different places. Now, we're not going to really go into parapatric speciation. Well, I'll tell you, first of all, a really simple case. Has everybody been to Palm Springs? Okay. So you take Highway 10. The farther east you go, the drier it gets. You go through Banning Pass. And then you dip down and you get to the hot desert. There, anybody know what quail are? Quail are these little chicken-like birds. They, anybody ever eat a quail in here? Okay, they're pretty tasty. Unfortunately for me, I'm a terrible shot. But, so I would starve if I actually had to survive on quail. But anyway, the main species we have around here is California. And then in the desert, there's something called gambas. And the California quail are adapted to a wetter climate, still kind of dry, but all the way from the coast inland to a certain point. And then the Gambel's quail are adapted to a very, very dry desert environment. The thing is, they actually come together along Highway 10, right around Banning, where it starts getting drier, and they form a hybrid zone. And they hybridize, and the offspring are viable, but the offspring are only viable in that area because it's kind of in between wet and dry. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about that. But then there's something called sympatric speciation, where you're actually speciating in the same place. And you think, well, wouldn't you have gene flow among all these different individuals and populations? And the idea is that you have to have something that keeps them separate. Okay, so the Grand Canyon is a good example. At one point, there was just one big mesa. It's style. It's called the Kaibab Plateau. It's about 6,500 feet. It slopes slightly north to south. And originally there was only one kind of squirrel. Okay, one species of squirrel. Then the Colorado River changed about 7 million years ago location and went right through it and started cutting away this Grand Canyon. Okay, and then there's the river, and now you have the north side on the left and the south side on the right. And those squirrels that were all one squirrel beforehand are now separated. As you can tell, squirrels, they're not going to cross, are they? They can't fly. Unless maybe a predator picked one up and carried it over and dropped it. Okay, so now this squirrel population that was all one is now separated and evolving into separate species. Okay, so here's vicariant speciation, kind of over time. We've got one population, you've got a river. This population has a variation in color and genes, and we can look at, and they all have about the same number in the population. And since there's 5 different colors, they're all 20% of the population. A barrier emerges, and namely the river, and splits this population, and you might have a similar distribution on both sides, or you might be that you've lost a few color morphs, whatever. Okay, so now these lizards, they can't get across. They're isolated from each other. Now, let's say that there's soil type exerts selection. Let's say there's lighter soil over here and darker soil over there. Okay? So, in terms of being adapted to one side or the other in terms of the color, there's now selection going on, and there's also mutation is happening. And in this case, there's this spotting mutation. Okay? And you can actually see that there are more light-colored morphs on the right side than the left side. And so you can see the difference in terms of frequency. After 40 generations, the spotting mutation has spread. Obviously, selection is favoring them. Whereas on the other side, it's kind of the same color of the soil that it used to be, so there hasn't been any real change, a little bit. More dark morphs, actually. So these populations are diverging. And then finally, 60 generations later, there's still variation, but there aren't very many dark ones. Okay. So that's vicariant speciation. Okay. So allopatry again is allopatric speciation. That's different homelands or different places. And what we have are these shrimp. And there are all these different species. The thing is, it turns out this guy and this guy are actually more closely related to each other than this guy is to this guy. Okay? Why? That's the Panama Canal. Was the Panama Canal always there? No. So the Panama Canal formed about 3 million years ago, and before that time, this whole area was all one ocean. It wasn't broken into the Caribbean and the Pacific. And so at one time, this and this, they shared a most recent common ancestor. Okay? And this did not. And so you can actually see, using this diagram, that on each case, let's say this is a 1 and 1, this and this are sister species, that and that, and then we'll say this and this are down here. Okay? So this is all because they've now been isolated because of the barrier of the Panama Canal. And so there's sister species, even though it looks like you would expect on either side that they'd be more related to each other, the different species. Okay. Now, I mentioned another kind of allopatree, and that's where you disperse to a new location. So here's our population again. There's now a bridge to this island. And they cross, and what kind of effect is this? This is a founder event. Okay? So it's probably a smaller population originally, right here. And it's probably not representative of this larger population. Okay? You can see that it's lighter green. So the same thing happens on spotty mutation. This is the founder event. And then let's say the water level drops after a certain period of time, and now we have all one bit of land, and they come back together, and like I asked before, what could possibly happen? Well, they come back together, interbreed, and fuse back together as a separate, as one species, or there might have been enough changes that they're now separate species. Okay, so a good example of this is Hawaiian Islands. Now, these guys are older. Then next oldest. Then the Maui complex. And then finally this island that's the big island. That's the most recent. And in fact, there's another one out here that's starting to form. Okay, so Kauai showed up about 5 million years ago. And somehow, now remember, Hawaii is really out in the eastern Pacific. And there is hardly anything nearby. So if any organism takes off from one of the continents, they're likely not going to make it, but given enough period of time, some might. So here we have fruit flies, and fruit flies somehow made it to Kauai about 5 million years ago, and some went over to Lanai, and then as Oahu arose about 4 million years ago, some actually were able to fly to Oahu, and so each of these populations started to evolve separately. And that didn't just happen with these fruit flies, it also happened with these kinds of plants called silver swords or crickets, and then these birds that we'll look at called trepannid honey creepers. And the same thing happened, because remember, these islands, when they first arose, they were completely volcanic. They were too hot to inhabit initially. So all the things that are on there right now had to get there by dispersal. Okay. Sympatric speciation. Now, sim means same location or same homeland. And you have sympatric individuals in the same geographic location, and they all live there and happily interbreed. But then something is causing this overall population to diverge because of selection. So in other words, they're less likely to breed the white ones with the green ones and vice versa, and they're more likely to breed within each type. That can be for a number of different reasons. We're going to go over that. And even though they're in the same place, the two populations might become isolated in terms of genetically isolated. Now, this was thought not to happen very often, but it's become more apparent. Okay. So, gene flow is still possible, but there's still a development of reproductive isolation without geographic barriers. And you end up with disruptive selection, let's say either for different environments, different time periods, different behavior, and some other things that we'll get to. So one of the best documented are these hawthorn and apple trees, and these flies. The hawthorn maggot flies were in North America first. Apples were brought by Europeans later. Okay, now normally, when you have some sort of insect eating some sort of plant, there's often a very tight relationship because the insect has evolved a way to detoxify the leaves that might have toxins in them. But anyway, these flies lay their eggs on hawthorn trees, and they also pollinate. Now, when the apples were brought in, some flies started laying their eggs on apples. The thing is, the flies that were laying their eggs on apples eventually preferred to lay their eggs on apples, and the ones on hawthorns preferred to lay their eggs on hawthorns. And they did this, they did a scent test to see whether, how the flies responded to the scent of hawthorn or apple. And it turns out that they separated each other according to which kind of tree they're reproducing on. So here you have these flies are now, even though these trees are all interspersed together, apple and hawthorn, even those flies now separate depending on what tree they lay their eggs on. And a similar thing happened. There was these big lakes in Africa, the Rift Valley lakes, like Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, I think another one, that are recent lakes. They got flooded, and there was a lot of different species. There was one kind of species that flooded in, and then a whole bunch of different species started speciating because of different water depths and where they were. And so, in the same kind of thing, there's sympatric speciation too, but they're separated by water depth and their ecology. Okay, and that's, we'll call that good. And then we'll finish up on Wednesday. I'm